The restaurant was the kind of place most people only saw in magazines. Crystal chandeliers hung above polished marble floors. Soft music floated through the room. And every table was filled with the city's most powerful people. But tonight, something felt different. Because sitting at the center table was a man everyone recognized. A billionaire. A man whose name appeared on skyscrapers, company headquarters, and magazine covers. But inside this restaurant, he was known for something else. Fear. Staff whispered about him long before he arrived. Stories passed between servers in quiet corners. How he once fired a chef in the middle of dinner service. How he humiliated a manager so badly the man quit the next day. How one complaint from him could destroy someone's career overnight. When he walked into the restaurant, conversation stopped. Shoulders stiffened. Managers suddenly appeared from every direction. And every employee knew one rule. Do not make a mistake. Because tonight, like many nights before, the billionaire looked irritated. His fingers tapped slowly against the table. Waiting, watching, judging. A young server approached with a bottle of expensive wine. His hands were shaking slightly. He tried to stay calm, tried to be careful. But in a moment of nervousness, the bottle tilted. A small splash of wine spilled across the tablecloth. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The billionaire's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood. His voice cut through the entire restaurant. Cold, sharp, embarrassing. He didn't just complain. He humiliated the young server in front of everyone. Customers looked down at their plates. No one wanted to make eye contact. Managers froze in place, unsure whether to intervene. The young server apologized again and again. But the billionaire wasn't finished. The room grew painfully quiet. Because everyone knew how this usually ended. Someone would lose their job. And no one would dare defend them. No one ever did. Until tonight. Because, from across the room, a new waitress began walking toward the table. Calm. Steady. Completely unshaken. At first, no one noticed. Then a few heads turned. Managers whispered urgently, trying to stop her. But she kept walking, straight toward the most feared customer in the building. The billionaire was still speaking when she reached the table. And then she said something. Not loudly, not aggressively, just simple, clear, and firm. There's no need to humiliate him. He already apologized. The words landed in the room like a dropped glass. Silence spread instantly. Every conversation stopped. Every movement froze. The billionaire slowly turned his head. His eyes lifted toward the waitress, studying her, confused, annoyed. Because in all the years he had been coming to this restaurant, no one had ever spoken to him like that. Not a manager, not an owner, and certainly not a waitress. For a moment, the entire room held its breath. Because everyone knew what usually happened next. But what the billionaire didn't realize was that this quiet waitress standing in front of him knew something about him that could destroy everything. Elite restaurants often look calm from the outside. Soft lighting, quiet music, polished glasses reflecting the chandeliers above. But the people working inside know something customers rarely see. Behind the elegance, there are rules. Unspoken ones. Rules about how to behave, how to serve, and most importantly, who must never be offended. Because in this restaurant, there was one guest who changed the entire atmosphere the moment he walked through the doors. Employees didn't say his name loudly. They didn't need to. Everyone knew exactly who they were talking about. The billionaire. The restaurant itself was one of the most exclusive places in the city. Reservations were booked weeks in advance. Celebrities dined there. Politicians held quiet meetings there. Business deals worth millions were signed over dinner at those polished tables. But the staff rarely talked about the famous guests. Instead, they talked about him. The billionaire who came in regularly. The one who always sat at the same table. And the one who had built a reputation that made even experienced employees nervous. Stories about him spread through the kitchen like quiet warnings. One chef told a story about a night 2 years earlier. Dinner service was in full swing. The dining room was full. Plates were moving quickly between the kitchen and the tables. Then the billionaire complained about a dish. Just one complaint. 10 minutes later, the head chef was gone. Fired in the middle of service. Another employee told a different story. A manager had tried to explain that the restaurant was fully booked. The billionaire wanted a private table immediately. When the manager hesitated, the conversation turned ugly. Customers nearby watched as the billionaire tore into him. Cold words. Sharp criticism. By the end of the night, the manager walked out of the restaurant with tears in his eyes. And then there was the story everyone whispered about. A restaurant branch across the city had once refused one of his last-minute requests. The very next week, a business deal connected to the billionaire collapsed. Investors disappeared. Within a month, that branch closed. No one could prove it was connected. But inside the company, people believed it was. So when the billionaire entered the restaurant now, the entire staff reacted the same way. Servers straightened their uniforms. Managers watched every detail. And no one wanted to get too close to his table. Not unless they absolutely had to. Because everyone knew something very simple. One mistake around him could ruin your career. The man himself rarely raised his voice without a reason. But the way he spoke made people uncomfortable even when he sounded calm. His words were precise, controlled, and often cutting. He had the kind of confidence that came from decades of power. Companies answered to him. Executives waited outside his office doors. Entire industries watched his decisions. And that power shaped the way he treated the world around him. Inside the restaurant, he behaved as if the entire building existed for his convenience. If he wanted a different table, someone moved. If he disliked a dish, the chef remade it. If the service slowed down even slightly, managers rushed to fix it. He expected obedience. And he usually got it. Because money had taught him a very clear lesson. Influence could solve almost any problem. Even the owner of the restaurant treated him carefully. Not out of friendship, but because the billionaire brought something extremely valuable. Connections. When he dined there, powerful investors sometimes joined him. Business leaders visited. Political figures appeared quietly in the corner booths. His presence meant attention, and attention meant profit. So the restaurant tolerated the tension he created. They tolerated the complaints. They tolerated the uncomfortable moments. Because losing him as a customer would mean losing much more. For years, that balance had remained the same. The billionaire demanded. The restaurant adjusted. And the staff stayed silent. But tonight, something unusual was about to happen. Earlier that same day, a new employee had started her first shift. Her name was Emily. She arrived before the evening service began. The restaurant was quieter then. Chairs were still being arranged. Glasses were polished under soft light. Emily listened carefully during her training. She nodded politely, asked a few simple questions, and spent most of the time quietly observing the room. There was something calm about the way she moved. Nothing rushed. Nothing nervous. Just quiet focus. She watched how the servers carried trays, how the managers communicated across the dining room, how the kitchen doors swung open and closed during busy moments. Most new employees looked overwhelmed on their first day. Emily didn't. She simply paid attention. During a short break, one of the other waiters approached her. He spoke quietly, almost cautiously. "There's something you should know." Emily looked up. "The billionaire comes here a lot," the waiter explained. "Everyone tries to avoid his table." Another server nearby added quickly, "Seriously, don't take his orders if you can help it." Emily listened, then nodded once. Calmly. She didn't argue. She didn't ask many questions. She simply returned to preparing for the evening shift. To the other employees, it seemed like she understood the warning. But none of them noticed one small detail. Emily didn't look intimidated. Not even a little. She looked thoughtful, as if she were studying something, as if the stories she heard were just pieces of a much larger puzzle. Outside, the evening crowd was beginning to arrive. Cars pulled up near the entrance. Valets moved quickly between the curb and the parking area. Inside, the restaurant lights brightened slightly as dinner service began. Tables filled with conversation. Wine glasses clinked softly. And somewhere in the city, a familiar luxury car was already moving toward the restaurant. The billionaire was on his way. Emily didn't know that yet. She didn't know that the man everyone feared would soon walk through those doors. And she certainly didn't know that in just a few hours, she would be standing directly in front of him. Dinner service had begun. The restaurant was now alive with conversation. Glasses clinked softly. Silverware tapped against porcelain plates. Waiters moved between tables with practiced precision. To the customers, everything looked perfect, elegant, effortless. But the staff knew something else was about to happen. Because outside the restaurant, a black luxury car slowly pulled up to the entrance. The valet attendants noticed it immediately. They exchanged quick glances. One of them whispered quietly, "He is here." Inside the restaurant, the shift manager was speaking with a server when he noticed movement near the entrance. His expression changed instantly. He leaned slightly toward another manager and spoke under his breath. "He is here." The message spread quickly. Not loudly, just quiet whispers moving from one employee to another. "He is here." Servers straightened their uniforms. Hosts adjusted their posture. Managers suddenly appeared closer to the dining floor. And then the restaurant doors opened. The billionaire stepped inside. He walked with slow confidence, the kind that comes from knowing every room he enters will eventually bend around him. The host greeted him politely. The billionaire barely nodded. He didn't need directions. He already knew where he was going. His usual table waited near the center of the restaurant. A table positioned perfectly under the warm glow of the chandelier. From there, he could see almost the entire dining room. He sat down without speaking. A waiter quickly approached with a menu. The billionaire didn't open it. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair. His eyes moved across the room, watching, observing, judging. The waiter cleared his throat softly. "Would you like your usual wine tonight, sir?" The billionaire nodded once. Expensive wine. One of the most costly bottles the restaurant offered. The waiter hurried away to retrieve it. But even before the wine arrived, the billionaire was already showing signs of irritation. His fingers tapped slowly against the table. His gaze followed the servers moving around the room. And after only a few minutes, he waved one of the managers over. The manager approached quickly. "Yes, sir. Is everything all right?" The billionaire didn't look pleased. "Service seems slower tonight." The manager apologized immediately. "Of course, sir. We will take care of that." The billionaire said nothing else. But the message was clear. Every employee in the room felt it. The tension in the restaurant slowly began to rise. In the kitchen, a young server carefully lifted a bottle of wine from the counter. It was the billionaire's order. The bottle alone cost more than the server made in an entire week. He swallowed nervously. A senior waiter noticed his expression. "First time serving him?" The young server nodded. The older waiter gave a quiet warning. "Just be careful." The young server took a slow breath. Then he began walking toward the billionaire's table. Step by step, trying not to rush, trying not to shake. The restaurant suddenly felt quieter around him. When he reached the table, the billionaire barely looked up. The server carefully began pouring the wine. His hand moved slowly, controlled. For a moment, everything seemed fine. But then something small happened. The edge of the bottle touched the rim of the glass slightly. His hand slipped, just enough for a thin splash of wine to spill across the white tablecloth. It wasn't much, just a small stain spreading across the fabric. But the moment it happened, the server's heart dropped, because the billionaire noticed immediately. The chair scraped loudly across the floor as the billionaire stood up. The sound cut through the restaurant. Every nearby conversation stopped. The billionaire stared at the tablecloth, then at the young server. His voice came out cold. "You cannot even pour wine properly." The server's face turned pale. "I am very sorry, sir." The billionaire didn't accept the apology. Instead, his voice grew louder. "This place charges hundreds of dollars for dinner. And this is the level of service you provide?" Guests nearby began watching. The young server apologized again. "I am sorry, sir. It was an accident." But the billionaire stepped closer. "Accident? Do you know how much this bottle costs? Do you know how much damage incompetent people like you cause businesses every day?" The young server lowered his head. He tried to speak again. But the billionaire continued. "People like you should not work in places like this. You are careless, unprofessional, replaceable." The words spread across the room like cold air. Customers avoided eye contact. Some looked down at their plates. Managers stood frozen nearby. No one wanted to interrupt, because everyone knew how dangerous that could be. The young server apologized again, his voice almost shaking now. "I am very sorry, sir." But the billionaire was not finished. "Perhaps the manager should reconsider whether you belong here at all." The young server stood there silently, embarrassed, powerless, and the entire restaurant watched it happen. Until suddenly, something unexpected began to change. Because from the far side of the room, someone started walking toward the table. At first, only a few people noticed. A single waitress moving slowly across the restaurant floor. Then another employee turned and saw her. Then another. Within seconds, whispers started spreading. It was the new waitress, Emily. She walked calmly, not rushed, not nervous, just steady. Her eyes focused directly on the billionaire's table. One of the managers noticed her approach. His voice dropped into a panicked whisper. "Stop her." But Emily kept walking. Another server tried to signal her quietly. "Don't go." She didn't stop. The billionaire was still speaking when she reached the table. The young server stood frozen beside him. The billionaire turned slightly, still frustrated. And then Emily spoke. Her voice was calm, clear, the kind of tone that carried across the silent restaurant without needing to be loud. He already apologized. There is no need to humiliate him. The sentence was simple, direct, but the effect was immediate. The restaurant fell completely silent. Every guest looked up. Every employee froze. Even the young server looked stunned, because no one had ever interrupted the billionaire like that before. The billionaire slowly stopped speaking. For a moment, he didn't move. Then slowly, he turned his head. His eyes lifted toward the waitress standing beside his table, studying her carefully, because in all the years he had been dining in this restaurant, no one had ever dared to challenge him. And now a waitress stood in front of him, unshaken, calm, looking directly at him. The billionaire narrowed his eyes slightly. The entire restaurant waited, because everyone knew something important was about to happen. The billionaire slowly turned his full attention toward her. The restaurant remained silent. Not the quiet of a peaceful dinner. The quiet of anticipation. Every guest had stopped eating. Every employee stood frozen. Because a moment had just happened that no one inside this building had ever witnessed before. A waitress had challenged the billionaire. And now everyone was waiting to see what he would do next. The billionaire stared at Emily. Not angrily at first. Not even surprised. He simply studied her. Slowly. Carefully. His expression carried a hint of amusement, as if he were trying to understand whether this moment was serious or some strange misunderstanding. Emily stood calmly beside the table, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't aggressive. She simply waited. The billionaire tilted his head slightly. His voice came out slower now, measured. "Do you know who you are talking to?" The question hung in the air. Everyone in the restaurant knew the answer. They had heard that question before. And every time someone heard it, the result was always the same. Apologies. Fear. Immediate obedience. But Emily didn't look away. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't hesitate. She simply answered, "Yes." Then, after a brief pause, she finished the sentence. "A customer." The words landed quietly, but the reaction around the room was immediate. Several guests exchanged glances. One man nearly dropped his fork. A server standing near the kitchen entrance inhaled sharply, because everyone understood what she had just done. She had stripped away the billionaire's power in a single sentence. Not an executive. Not a powerful investor. Not the most feared guest in the restaurant. Just a customer. The billionaire's eyes narrowed slightly. The amusement faded from his expression. Because in all the years he had been coming here, no one had ever spoken to him like that. The billionaire leaned forward slightly. Now his tone was colder, more serious. "You must be new here." Emily said nothing. The billionaire continued. "Perhaps no one has explained how things work in this place." He gestured lightly toward the young server who still stood beside the table. "People who make mistakes here usually face consequences." The young server shifted uncomfortably. The billionaire turned his attention back to Emily. "But it seems you would prefer to involve yourself in matters that do not concern you." His voice hardened slightly. "That is not a wise decision." The room felt tense again. The billionaire straightened his jacket slowly. "I could call the owner of this restaurant right now." His gaze remained fixed on Emily. "And I promise you, this conversation would end very differently." Several employees exchanged worried looks. The shift manager had already started walking toward the table. His steps were cautious, careful, trying not to escalate the situation, but also trying to prevent it from getting worse. The billionaire continued speaking. "A single phone call for me, and your employment here would end before the night is over." His voice dropped slightly lower. "And if I chose to make another call, you might find it very difficult to work in this industry again." The threat was clear. Not loud, not dramatic, but powerful. The manager moved closer, clearly nervous now. Emily remained exactly where she was. She didn't step back. She didn't argue. She didn't show fear. She simply listened. The billionaire waited for her reaction, because this was the moment people usually back down. The moment when reality returned. When employees remembered who they were dealing with. But Emily didn't move. And then, she said something that made the billionaire pause. Emily spoke calmly, almost thoughtfully. "If you call the owner, he may want to hear the full story." Her voice carried no anger, no sarcasm, just quiet confidence. The billionaire stopped moving. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked slightly confused. He studied her again, carefully, as if searching for something he had missed. The manager stopped walking, unsure whether to intervene now. The billionaire's expression changed slowly. Curiosity replaced irritation. "What full story?" Emily held his gaze, her posture still calm, still composed. The young server looked back and forth between them nervously. Several guests leaned slightly closer to hear. Emily didn't raise her voice, but every word carried clearly across the silent room. The story about what happened here tonight. The billionaire stared at her, then glanced briefly at the manager, then back at Emily again. Something about her confidence didn't match the situation. Waitresses didn't usually speak like this. They certainly didn't challenge him with calm certainty. And they definitely didn't sound like they knew something he didn't. The billionaire narrowed his eyes slightly. Now, he was studying her with real attention, trying to understand what was happening. Because, suddenly, this waitress didn't seem like an ordinary employee anymore. For a moment, no one spoke. The billionaire continued staring at Emily. But the atmosphere in the restaurant had already changed. Just minutes ago, the situation had been simple. A powerful man humiliating an employee. A mistake with a glass of wine. Another uncomfortable scene everyone would eventually forget. But now something else was happening. Something the billionaire clearly hadn't expected. Because the waitress standing in front of him did not look intimidated. She looked certain. And certainty made powerful people uncomfortable. The billionaire straightened slightly. His expression hardened again. Whatever curiosity he felt a moment ago quickly turned back into authority. His voice became colder. careful, controlled. You are forgetting something. Emily said nothing. The billionaire continued. This restaurant exists because people like me choose to support it. His gaze moved briefly across the room, then returned to her. If I decided tomorrow that this place was no longer worth my time, things could change very quickly. The message was clear. Everyone in the restaurant understood what he meant. Powerful investors, powerful friends. One phone call. Businesses collapsed that way all the time. The shift manager lowered his eyes nervously. Several employees looked uncomfortable again. But Emily's expression didn't change. She tilted her head slightly, almost thoughtfully. Then she replied with calm simplicity. That would be interesting. The billionaire frowned slightly. He hadn't expected that response. But before he could speak again, Emily continued. Her voice remained steady, almost conversational, especially considering what happened at Calderon Industries 3 years ago. The name landed quietly in the air, but the effect was immediate. The billionaire stiffened. It was subtle, almost invisible to someone who didn't know what to look for. But several people nearby noticed it. His shoulders tightened slightly. His eyes narrowed. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the billionaire looked genuinely surprised. Because Calderon Industries was not something most people mentioned casually. Especially not employees in a restaurant. Especially not waitresses. Emily watched his reaction carefully. Then she added one more sentence. The restructuring project. The one that removed over 200 employees in a single quarter. The billionaire didn't respond. But the silence said enough. Because something important had just shifted. And now the power dynamic in the room was beginning to change. The restaurant had grown even quieter. Guests who had originally tried to ignore the situation were now watching openly. Some leaned slightly forward in their chairs. Others whispered quietly to the people beside them. The tension in the room had transformed. This was no longer just an uncomfortable argument. Now it felt like something much bigger. The shift manager looked confused. He glanced from Emily to the billionaire, trying to understand what was happening. The billionaire's voice returned slowly, but the confidence from earlier had faded slightly. How do you know about that company? His tone was sharper now, more careful. Emily did not rush her answer. She took a small breath, then replied simply, I used to work somewhere connected to it. The billionaire watched her closely. His mind was moving quickly now, trying to place her, trying to understand how a waitress could know details about a corporate restructuring that had never been discussed publicly. Guests nearby continued whispering. The young server still stood beside the table, completely silent, completely confused. Emily looked toward him briefly, then back to the billionaire. Her voice remained calm, professional, almost distant. But there was something else in it now. Something deeper. Something personal. The billionaire noticed it too. His eyes narrowed further. Connected how? Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked slowly around the room, taking in the dozens of people watching the conversation. Then she returned her attention to him. But that was only part of the truth. Emily stepped slightly closer to the table. Not aggressively. Just enough to make sure her voice carried clearly. 3 years ago, she began slowly. I worked in one of your companies. The billionaire's expression tightened. Calderon Industries. The name hung in the air again. Guests exchanged curious looks. Emily continued calmly. At the time, it was undergoing what your executives called an operational restructuring. The billionaire said nothing, but the tension in his posture grew obvious. Emily's tone remained steady. 200 employees lost their jobs during that process. Some of them had worked there for decades. The billionaire's jaw tightened slightly. Emily looked briefly toward the young server beside the table, then back to him again. One of those employees was his father. The word spread through the restaurant like a ripple. Several guests leaned forward in their seats. The young server blinked in confusion. He clearly hadn't expected his name to become part of the conversation. Emily continued speaking. Still calm. Still composed. But now her voice carried quiet weight. Your company claimed the layoffs were necessary. You said the restructuring would save the business. The billionaire shifted slightly. His expression had lost its earlier arrogance. But Emily wasn't finished. What most people never heard was how many families were affected by those decisions. She looked again toward the young server. He was only 16 when his father lost that job. The young man beside the table looked stunned now. He stared at Emily, trying to understand how she knew that. Emily turned back to the billionaire. And now, tonight, you stand here humiliating him for spilling a few drops of wine. The restaurant had gone completely silent. The billionaire did not respond. For the first time since he had entered the building, he had no words ready. Guests looked between the two of them. The manager looked overwhelmed. The young server stood frozen beside the table. Because suddenly everyone in the room understood something. This was no longer just an argument between a customer and a waitress. This was something much deeper. Something that had been building for years. And in that moment, the entire restaurant realized the situation had completely changed. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The restaurant remained completely silent. Not the polite quiet of fine dining, but the heavy silence that follows an unexpected truth. The billionaire stood beside the table, still, motionless. His eyes remained fixed on Emily, but something about his posture had changed. Only minutes earlier, he had filled the room with authority. His voice had controlled the conversation. His anger had shaped the atmosphere. Now the room felt different. The power he once carried so easily had begun to slip, and everyone in the restaurant could feel it. The billionaire cleared his throat slowly. His expression hardened again, as if he were trying to recover the control he had lost. His voice returned, but it sounded different now. Less confident, more defensive. This conversation is inappropriate. His eyes moved briefly across the room. Several guests were openly watching now. Then he turned back to Emily. Whatever happened in one of my companies years ago has nothing to do with a mistake made tonight. He gestured lightly toward the tablecloth. A glass of wine spilled on a table. That is the situation here. Emily listened quietly. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She simply waited for him to finish. Then she responded calmly. It wasn't just one company. The billionaire frowned slightly. Emily continued. Calderon Industries was only one example. Her voice remained measured, controlled. Your restructuring projects affected more than 200 employees in that single year. Some of them had worked there their entire lives. Several guests shifted in their seats. The billionaire crossed his arms, clearly uncomfortable now. Emily spoke without raising her voice. Many of those people struggled for months to find work again. Some had families, children, responsibilities. She paused briefly, just enough for the room to absorb the words. The billionaire attempted to interrupt, but Emily continued speaking calmly, not attacking, not exaggerating, just stating facts. Because decisions made in boardrooms often look very different from the lives they affect. The billionaire looked away for a moment, then back again. His irritation had faded. Now something else appeared in his expression. Discomfort. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked uncertain. Because now he was no longer the one asking questions. Now he was the one being watched. Emily turned slightly toward the young server. He still stood quietly beside the table, embarrassed, confused, trying to understand how the situation had turned into something so much larger. Then she looked back at the billionaire. Her voice softened slightly, not sympathetic, but steady. People make mistakes. The sentence hung in the air, a simple truth, but powerful in its timing. She continued, a glass can slip, a hand can shake. That happens to everyone. The billionaire said nothing. Emily glanced briefly toward the wine stain on the tablecloth, then back at him. But humiliating someone does not fix the mistake. Her tone remained calm, almost thoughtful. It only creates another one. The restaurant remained completely silent. No plates moved. No conversations resumed. Guests listened closely. Employees stood frozen. The young server lowered his head slightly. Emily continued speaking. That young man is here trying to do his job, trying to earn a living, just like his father once did. The billionaire's expression tightened. Emily didn't raise her voice, but her words carried weight across the room. Everyone deserves dignity while doing honest work. The billionaire slowly looked around the restaurant. For the first time that evening, he noticed something unusual. Every table was watching him, not with admiration, not with fear, but with expectation. The shift manager stood quietly near the edge of the dining room. Even the kitchen staff had gathered near the doors. Everyone was waiting to see how the most powerful person in the room would respond. The billionaire turned back toward Emily, but the authority he once carried had faded, because for the first time in many years, he had no control over the room. The silence in the restaurant stretched for several seconds. No one moved. No one spoke. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the billionaire. Only minutes earlier, his voice had dominated the room. His anger had filled the space between the tables. His presence alone had been enough to make experienced employees nervous. But now something different had taken hold of the room. Expectation. People were waiting to see how a man who controlled companies, industries, and fortunes would respond when someone finally challenged him. The billionaire stood beside the table. Still, his gaze slowly moved across the restaurant. He saw the guests watching, the employees standing quietly, the young server beside him, frozen with uncertainty. Then his eyes returned to Emily. For a moment, his expression was difficult to read. Pride, frustration, reflection, all passing across his face at once. Many people expected him to react the way powerful men often do, with anger, with dismissal, with another display of authority. But something unexpected happened instead. The billionaire slowly pulled out his chair. The sound of the chair sliding across the floor echoed softly in the silent room. Then he sat down. The movement was small, but it changed the entire atmosphere. The young server looked surprised. Several guests exchanged quiet glances. The billionaire looked up at the young man standing beside the table. For a moment he said nothing. Then finally he spoke. His voice was quieter than before. "You are right." The young server blinked, unsure whether he had heard correctly. The billionaire continued. "I reacted too strongly." Another pause. Then he looked directly at the young server. "I apologize." The words were simple, but their impact spread instantly across the room. Several guests straightened in their seats. A quiet wave of surprise moved through the restaurant, because no one had ever heard the billionaire apologize before. Not here. Not anywhere. The young server nodded slowly, still processing what had just happened. Then the billionaire turned slightly toward Emily. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. No anger. No hostility. Just a long, thoughtful pause. Then Emily gave a small, respectful nod. Nothing dramatic. Just acknowledgement. After that, she stepped back from the table, calmly, quietly, and returned to her work, as if the moment that had just changed the entire room was simply part of another ordinary evening. Slowly, the restaurant began returning to life. Conversations resumed in soft voices. Glasses clinked again. Servers continued moving between tables. But something about the atmosphere felt different. The tension that once filled the room had faded, replaced by something quieter, something thoughtful. The billionaire remained seated for several minutes, silent, reflective. When he finally stood to leave, the restaurant doors opened once more. The night air drifted briefly inside. He walked toward the exit, but before stepping outside, he paused. He looked back across the room. His eyes found Emily again. She was serving another table now, focused, professional, as if nothing unusual had happened. The billionaire watched for a moment, not angry, not offended, just thoughtful. Then he turned and walked out into the night. And in the quiet that followed, one simple truth lingered in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the moment. Because sometimes, the most powerful person in the room is not the one with the most money. It is the one who is not afraid to speak the truth.